Like we say, you need to love all of that God created in the world. Everything that God created, you need to love, except yourself. I mean, that's a different category. You need to despise yourself because God's despise.
Hmm.
It doesn't even make sense, does it? Without that nurturing relationship, which co-regulates the child, and that's where the child learns to self-regulate, then they not only believe that the world is a dangerous place and no one is there for them, but they also believe that they're unworthy, that the reason all this is happening to them is because it's their fault. There's something wrong with them. So all you can do is believe that you must have a spiritual problem.
Hello, everyone. This is What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Today, I have Janyne McConnaughey on. We're going to be talking about childhood development and how that affects church, and what kind of Christian you can be, and how that affects the Christian life. So, how are you doing today, Janyne?
Good, good. I'm clear across the country from you in below Seattle, Washington, and we're having
Oh,
a cloudy, cool day today. Yay.
oh, fun, fun,
Yeah.
awesome. Okay, so for those that aren't familiar with you, which is probably all of my audience, can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
So I was raised in the Church of the Nazarene. My dad was a Nazarene pastor, and my mother was a teacher. And was raised in the church and went to Point Loma Nazarene University, which moved while I was there. So it started out as Pasadena College, and then it changed to Point Loma Nazarene. And I was a child development and Christian education major, and my goal was to work in the field of early childhood education, which at that time everyone was like, you're going to do babysitting, you're going to get a college degree to do babysitting. And I knew that the early childhood years were the most crucial and important
Right.
years of a child's life, but that was way ahead of where most everyone was. So I went from there and I taught kindergarten and I directed preschools and so forth. And then I ended up in teacher education at two different Bible colleges. So one was Nazarene and one was Baptist. And I married a Baptist, and so I spent some time in Baptist world, and then returned to the church of my heritage. And in the midst of that, because they were preparation colleges, ministry preparation colleges, then I was involved in ministry preparation. And so I was 60 years old and completing my 40th year in education, and ended up in therapy because of surfacing childhood trauma. And I went on a healing journey for 3 years of intensive therapy,
Hmm.
and came out on the other side and began publishing books and speaking and helping people to understand what healing from trauma
Hmm.
entailed. And so that's kind of what, in general, I until this summer, I have served as president of the board for the Attachment and Trauma Network, and for the past 2 years. And we work to help communities, churches, anyone who works with children to understand how to help children impacted by trauma. I also teach courses for the Masters in Education and Neuroscience and Trauma for Tabor College, which is in Kansas. I teach those classes online. So, but most of that evolved out of the last 5 years after my healing journey.
Very, very cool. Awesome. Yeah, I might have to tune into some of those classes sometime. That sounds great. Okay, so obviously you've written a lot of really great books, and a lot of it, is what we're going to talk about today. But could you tell people just the types of books you've written, the subjects, just um, basically tell them why they should
Why you
look
should
into it.
read them? Why
Yeah, right.
why you should these are the reasons you should buy my books. Um, I the first one that I published is Brave, and it is this story of healing childhood trauma. And in it, I go through. It's basically it's a memoir with psychoeducational memoir in which I explain the impact of trauma, and I explain the impact it had on me and the process of healing. And so that was the first book. And anyone who's wanting to understand the impact that especially early childhood trauma has on a child, that
Mm.
is the book to read. I decided no one should ever feel as lonely as I did on that therapy couch, and so I'm very vulnerable. And I'm not graphic. It's no use re-traumatizing people. I try to be really careful through that, but I
Mhm.
wanted people to really understand what it was like to be an adult healing from the experiences of childhood. Then the
Yeah.
second book is Jeannie's Brave Childhood, which talks about behaviors and attachment, and and it is a book that helps people to understand. It's my story again, but it helps people to understand the behaviors that are a result of the impact of trauma, and and the different ways that we're helping children heal from the impact of trauma. And then the third book was A Brave Life, and it's my faith journey. It's through my adult life without healing. And so it's my spiritual journey, and it's really the precursor to Trauma in the Pews, which is my fourth book. Trauma in the Pews: The Impact on Faith and Spiritual Practices. And that's the book. Trauma in the Pews is what most people know me by. I mean, I most people know me from that book, and then they're like, "Oh, you wrote three other books." Yes, I did
Yeah.
write three other books. And so Trauma in the Pew, all the first books are written to help people understand survivors, but they're also written to survivors. I taught children's literature for 33 years. There's all sorts of elements because fantasy is so crucial for the survival of children who've been impacted by trauma. And
Hmm.
so I weave fantasy, Alice in Wonderland, and The Wizard of Oz all through those books to help tell the story. And then Trauma in the Pews is a totally different kind of book written to ministry leaders to help ministry leaders understand the people sitting in their pews who've been impacted by childhood trauma, and how we unintentionally, for the most part, do re-traumatize people who are sitting in the pews who've been impacted.
Yeah.
So depending on where what it is that you want, if you're a survivor, the Brave books are definitely for you. If you're someone who wants to understand survivors, I have a lot of times that Brave will be recommended by therapists for their clients to read so they can understand their own story.
Hmm.
And if you're a ministry leader, then Trauma in the Pews. But the book has been just embraced by the people sitting in the pews who are like, oh, finally, I feel like somebody saw me. And
Hmm.
so I would say that it's been pushed to success by the people sitting in the pews.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great to hear. Yeah, really, really awesome stuff. I'd recommend everybody check out all of those. So the a topic you just mentioned, which was just really fascinating to me, is that we, as your typical church, which is supposed to be a good benefit, and oftentimes is, at the same times can have negative consequences, or just everybody knows about bad experiences at church. And hopefully it doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen to some people. And what you talk about is, you go into detail how actually you can be re-traumatized at church of all places, um, you know but your childhood affects that in some way. And it's just really fascinating to me how that could affect your Christian life, and how whether you can serve God, and all kinds of different other topics. So could you talk about, specifically in the context of the church, how can talk to us about this re-traumatization idea?
So this book came out of, and I think that you watched the presentation I did for the religious trauma,
Yeah.
and I think that's how that got connected. And I did two sessions for that, and in the last
Mm.
one I talk about how what God intended. God intended for children to be born into nurturing, healthy families, to be supported by parents, to be our caretakers, to be loved and nurtured, and to develop a secure attachment. So when we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the very basic level is the physical safety, to be fed, to be, and then it goes into emotional needs, and then and so forth. And so what happens to children who have abuse and traumatic experiences in early childhood is that they never develop those foundations. And so when I do slides, I have a slide that shows Maslow's hierarchy, and then I just put an X through the whole bottom section of it, and I put survival. And
Hmm.
so where a child, and with a really healthy secure attachment with a parent, would be able to say, oh yeah, I did that, I got into the cookie jar, okay, and they would be in trouble, but they would know the parent would love them, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas a
Hmm.
child who is afraid, their natural tendency would be to lie about that. And so that behavior is an indicator that they do not have the security to be able to tell the truth. And
Hmm.
so when you have that beginning foundation decimated, it does trauma. Well, first of all, trauma, let's talk about that. Trauma is
Sure.
anything that overwhelms the nervous system. And so beyond the place of being able to cope. So if you think of an adult being overwhelmed by a car accident, or well, then if you think about a child who doesn't even have a developed nervous system yet, they are so completely overwhelmed. And so they don't, and if without that nurturing relationship, which co-regulates the child, and that's where the child learns to self-regulate, then
Hmm.
then they not only believe that the world is a dangerous place and no one is there for them, but they also believe that they're unworthy, that there's nothing, that the reason all this is happening to them is because it's their fault, there's something wrong with them, and that's where
Hmm.
shame is born. So when you so when you have someone who comes into the church with that healthy nurturing relationship, and the concept of sin is talked about, they can say, oh, I know God loves me, and sometimes I do things that are, when you talk to someone, when you do that same sermon, it's really interesting because you can interview people about what did you get out of a particular sermon, and they can have
Yeah.
two completely different perceptions of it. And someone who already believes that they're unworthy, they're just like, oh, I'm just on the ground, I'm just wretched, I'm just, and so it one of the hardest things for a survivor to do is to overcome those feelings of unworthiness. And so when they come into the church already feeling unworthy, and we
Hmm.
sing all the songs, and we do the sermons talking about how unworthy they are, they're like, yeah, right, I already knew that, this seems right, this is absolutely right. But it doesn't lead to them to heal,
Hmm.
right? They it doesn't lead that. And so when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself, well, then that indicates that you kind of have to like yourself too. And that is what they do not come into the church feeling like. And so all of the things that are done to condemn behavior without an understanding of why those behaviors exist.
Hmm.
Okay, so for instance, um and I'm going to jump to the ACEs study, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And
Okay.
it was done in the 1990s. And what it did was it connected adverse childhood experiences that occurred before a person was 18. And they were working with Kaiser Permanente and the CDC, and it connected it to health issues later in life. Okay. But it also connected it to behaviors, and risky behaviors such as smoking, drinking, alcohol, um, uh, death by suicide,
Hmm.
um, just a whole litany of these things. And that was kind of my turning point where I went, oh, wait a minute. Wait a minute. These are connected to adverse experiences. And this is what the church is calling sin. And it doesn't, just because you have adverse experiences doesn't mean that you absolutely will have these consequences. But with every increased number of adverse experiences, the more likely it is that you're going to
Hmm.
have physical ramifications, and that you are going to try to find ways to soothe your nervous system through addictive behaviors.
Hmm.
Okay. So to say that it's sin, uh, doesn't doesn't take care of the problem, right?
Hmm.
Like I don't know. As a kid, I just saw people run down to the altar again and again and again, and then they go right back out and do the same thing
Sure.
again. Like, why don't they get it? John Wesley saw that. He was like, some people really are helped by the spiritual practices, and some people it doesn't help at all, right?
Yeah.
And that's because of the trauma, and that they're caught in those trauma loops. And until they learn ways to regulate their nervous system, and they begin to believe in themselves, then it's really hard for them to get out of those cycles. So that's a really long answer, but if you're standing before a congregation of people of 100, if there are 100 people, 25 percent of them have experienced sexual abuse. And so it's similar. Well, we don't really have people with trauma in our. Yeah, yeah, you do. You do. No one would have ever looked out in the church congregation and spotted me, the Bible college professor for 33 years, as someone who had experienced an extensive amount of childhood abuse and trauma.
Hmm.
Thankfully, not by my father, which makes it so much better for me.
Hmm.
But all connected to the church. And so you have people sitting in your pews who have gone through trauma, and they don't understand why they're dysregulated, why they can't get away from behaviors, and they don't feel worthy. And our
Hmm.
teachings just convince them that they really are the problem.
Hmm.
So that's
Wow.
a really long answer to that.
No, I appreciate that. I love all the detail we can get. So, one example you talked about was the idea that you're more likely to try and be whatever everyone wants you to be. So, an obvious example is your pastor or your church leader or whatever says, "Hey, I want you to do this rule, or I want you to put these chairs away," and um, and I guess you've talked about, I guess, the idea of they're more likely to want to do them, but I guess that doesn't sound that bad. But there can obviously be some bad scenarios when I guess you have a overwhelming desire to please the person.
Mhm.
Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, and so in the center part of Trauma in the Pews, I use, as a guide, I use Foster's disciplines from Celebration of Discipline. And so I go through prayer. You would think after doing this so many times, I could just recite these, right? But it probably not. Okay. But prayer, solitude, silence, submission, service, all of these things that are used as practices in the church. And I
Okay.
go through each one, and I specifically say how trauma can impact. And of course, everyone's story
Mm,
is different.
yeah.
My story is different than the other person's story. And so how it impacts us is different. So there is no one answer to this. But for instance, I, if part of your childhood trauma is the fact that your needs were not met as a small child, then your need for validation, your need to have to be accepted, to belong, which is really a biological need, then you go into adulthood looking for ways to please people, to be validated, to
Hmm.
and so you end out with someone who just volunteers for
Hmm.
everything, right? And then what happens is that they burn out. They just
Mm.
they're doing everything. They're like the most amazing church member you'd ever want to have. They're that
Yeah.
1% that they're just doing everything. And that was me. I was involved in everything. And then I would burn out and I would just collapse. And I talk about in the book how I had to quit everything and nobody understood that. Right?
Wow.
Nobody understood. Well, well, why isn't she in church? Why isn't, did she backslide? Has she lost her faith? No.
Mm.
I wore myself out and collapsed because I was trying to do everything to please everyone. So another one would be that the people who their nervous systems are so dysregulated, and especially if they've experienced religious trauma, and coming to church is a absolutely horrific experience for them because their nervous system is so dysregulated. And so they come and then they can't do it, right? And then they come and they can't do it. Well, they're not regular attenders, they're not, and that's seen as a spiritual problem when in reality it's just because their nervous system is so overwhelmed. So it's kind of funny that I named the book Trauma in the Pews, and part of my trauma is that when I sit in a church pew or in a line of chairs, I just feel
Hmm.
pinned there. I feel like I have no choice. I can't get up, I can't leave, and my nervous system just goes on fire. So
Oh
it's
wow.
probably where the name of the book came from, and that is all related to my trauma. Right, it doesn't have anything to do with me wanting to be there or not. In a recent book, JK Ramsey, in Courage, I think, she talks about how she had experienced church trauma and she tried to go back to church and her body would not let her. And so in my next book I'm going to talk about that more, because trauma is embedded in the body. And you
Hmm.
can say all day long, this is a safe place. There's nothing unsafe about this place, but your
Hmm.
body is the one who's telling you whether you feel safe or not.
Wow.
And so that's another one. Uh, so they're more likely to do what everyone wants them to do. A difficulty in setting boundaries and just being able to say no,
Hmm.
or just being able to express needs. And so you just end out looking around, seeing what everybody's doing, and trying to be the very best Christian you can be. But what you don't have is that joy, because a trauma often will block your ability to experience joy. So you're just doing, and trying harder and harder. And when you go for help, then you're said, well, you just need to read your Bible more. Okay. You need to, well, that's not gonna that I was a Bible college professor. Right? This
Right.
is the
Yeah. Exactly.
irony of that. Okay, this is the irony of that. That there wasn't anybody on the planet who was trying harder, right? I was doing everything I could possibly do to overcome the turmoil I had and the dysregulation I had as a result of my trauma, and going through panic attacks and PTSD
Wow.
and everything, and not knowing what it was. And so, yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I'm sure that was difficult.
wait, and it's really difficult when you don't understand that it isn't your problem,
True. Hmm.
right? So all you can do is believe that you must have a spiritual problem, you know, and
Hmm.
so it's very defeating, and so that I probably gotten more emails from people saying thank you. And actually, the quote that I use, when I published A Brave Life, one of my readers from South Africa wrote me and said, "Nobody ever told me it wasn't a spiritual problem."
Hmm.
And so we're trying to solve a problem with the wrong answer, right?
Hmm.
It's not the dysregulation in your body is not because you're not trying to be spiritual. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's crazy to think about. So, maybe you could talk just a little bit more there. So, about that feeling of, hey, you're told it's spiritual, like, or maybe you even think that there's a spiritual issue going on where like you don't love God enough or something like that.
Right. And
Um,
you can't believe that God loves you.
True, that too.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you can't believe that your parents loved you, how do you or caretakers or whoever,
Mm,
how do you believe that if the people you actually could see and touch, you don't believe they love you, how can you believe that an unseen God can love you?
mm, mm,
Right? So one of the things that I love about my journey is um how diligent God was in showing me that I was loved,
mm.
just just for me.
Yeah.
Just I talk about in my first book, I talk about that. But I survivor stories who manage to heal. And I just had someone message me today and talk about how he was so grateful to God that he was able to access therapy, and that he could get all of that out of his body and
Mm,
express it in a safe place. And I'm really sad. I'm really sad when people feel like that healing trauma belongs, over here, and faith and spirituality belongs over here.
mm,
Because when you heal the trauma, they should be intertwined together. And that's kind of where I'm headed next, is to take that false idea that trauma-based healing cannot walk hand in hand with spirituality.
mm.
And so, but a lot of spirituality says to leave the past behind, to ignore your feelings, ignore your
Yeah.
emotions, to try harder, and all of those things fight against the actual healing of trauma.
Wow. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so specifically on that idea of, you know, you're not spiritual enough, you're, I guess you just don't love God. What can, how does that work? Like, obviously, I would assume that there's some negative effects of that, of, uh, I mean, I guess, you're trying to get you're trying not to do wrong things essentially, and you keep doing them, and I don't know, maybe you can fill in those words there.
Yeah, and
Like,
maybe it's
what
not
is
that
that like? How does that look?
maybe it's not that you're doing wrong things. Like
Okay.
I was an extremely moral life, like from my young adult on, I was doing everything right, but I wasn't able to access spiritual disciplines.
Hmm.
And so it was like it wasn't that I had bad behaviors. Well, I was. Okay, so when we talk about addiction, and like I had to be busy all the time. I c- I c-
Hmm.
I had to be doing, 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 doing. I collected things. Some people shop. Some people will, they'll get super involved in sports, obsessively,
Yeah.
all of these things to try to distance themselves from the inner turmoil that's caused by trauma. So there's a lot of different, when we talk about addiction, we want to talk about the ones other people do instead
Yeah.
of the ones that we do. We all
True.
have ways that we, whether we binge watch something or we play
Hmm.
games on our phone, or there's tons of things that we do, and they're all trying to calm our nervous systems in this crazy
Hmm.
world that doesn't give us many opportunities.
Yeah.
So but I think that, okay, so let's talk about attachment. Okay.
Okay.
So because I think I have to do that to answer the question. So
Okay.
there's a lot going around about attachment styles, and all attachment styles are the result of whether your attachment with your primary caregiver at birth went well or whether it didn't go well. So there's secure attachment, and then there's a whole bunch of other styles, right?
Hmm.
And so a lot of times they'll say, well, that's just who you are. You have a insecure whatever your style. That's why I don't really like to talk about styles, because that sounds like you were born that way, but
Hmm.
actually everybody was born to have a secure attachment. And I mean, there's personality factors, there's home factors, there's cultural factors, there's a lot that goes into it. So I don't want to make it too simplistic. But those children who did not have a secure attachment relationship with a parent, they're going to live that out in all of their adult relationships and their relationships to worship and God
Hmm.
and everything. Okay.
Hmm.
And the key factor in trauma based therapy is relationship, because the only way, especially if the trauma that a person has experienced is has been relational trauma, relational betrayal as a child. Like, you have to, on my in my slides, I showed the little person going back and climbing up those foundational building blocks. And the church has a wonderful opportunity to do that. They have a wonderful opportunity to rebuild. It's called earned attachment, earned secure attachment. And it comes through a relationship with another person. And so for me, that was my therapist. Okay. And that I can't conceive with the level of trauma and religious trauma and all sorts of things that I experienced, that it could have been any other way. I needed that professional, um, boundaried
Hmm.
relationship with someone who was all in the game for me. I mean, I even was, I struggled with, I'm paying someone for a no, that, no, it wasn't. If you That's a distrust, right? Because they wouldn't be in the field if they didn't want to have relationships that would heal people.
Hmm.
Okay. I mean, and psychology, they kind of got off the tracks in my mind when they were like discouraging no, boundaried relationships, boundaried.
Hmm.
And that's one reason that I don't think that pastors they don't need to do, because it's takes a lot of skill and training to have a relationship with someone that is boundaried. And I think the professionals are trained to do that, where church staff people are not, because someone who experienced betrayal trauma, they when somebody somebody finally cares about them, it is really hard to keep those boundaries in place and make
Hmm.
everything do that. So, excuse me, got a pain in my back. So, the um, so when we talk about, I'm probably gotten lost from your question, but I thought it was important to go back and say that that attachment is the antidote for trauma,
Hmm.
and it is not an easy thing to stay in the game with someone as they're healing from trauma, because it's messy. It's they one day they put I put my therapist on a pedestal, and the next day I'm so angry with her I don't ever want to go back, and I'm sending an email telling her that, right? So all of that, people have difficulty with that, but if you
Yeah.
understand that that is a natural part of healing from trauma, that I needed to be able to do that, and she did not leave me, and so I learn to trust, and trust is the key factor. So
Hmm.
um but a lot of times in the church we have a hard time having a relationship with someone without judging them or telling them what they should be doing,
Hmm.
instead of just accepting them unconditionally.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
know if
That's
I answered
something.
your question. I probably went off.
That's okay. I don't even remember what the question is, to be honest. That's okay.
I'm sorry.
No, totally, all good stuff. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I really do. Okay, so we'll come back to a little bit of that. But okay, what about, let's see here, service and worship without joy. So this one was really interesting to me because, from my perspective, there are a lot of times where, like, is I've had times in my life where, like, I really really enjoy worship, and other times where, like, it's just kind of boring. But you kind of, explained how this idea in a completely different way that I never even considered. So Can you talk about your experiences of worshiping without joy?
Um, I felt good. I felt good about the fact I was serving.
Okay.
I did not I did not I didn't I wouldn't I so a lot of times we get worship and service kind of mixed up,
Okay.
right? Like we say our worship is our service. And that's not true. Our worship is really a communal, if we talk about church worship, it's a communal relationship with God, pure and simple.
Okay.
That God is there for us, and we're there for God, and we are having this relationship which should spark joy. Okay, so the thing about a dysregulated nervous system is that you cannot feel joy if your nervous system is not regulated. So I kind of got the idea for this, understood this when I would have, and um Deb Dana in her book calls them glimmers. I would have a glimmer. I'd be looking at a sunset. I want to be like, oh my gosh, it's beautiful. I have so many sunset pictures on my phone. It's just ridiculous. You can never capture what it actually is, right? So, but or a bird, would land right in front of me, and I would just be like, "Oh my gosh, look at." And so nature is a really big worship experience because I have a glimmer. I feel like, "Oh my gosh, God put all this here for us." Well, that's worship right there, right?
Hmm.
And so when it isn't, we can have worship in church, but our worship does not need to be limited to church. But of course, if we're talking about church, then we need to talk about what does worship in church look like. And I think that a lot of times I see people like do the self-loathing like it's worship. Like, oh, I'm so wretched, and God loved me despite the fact that I'm so wretched and I'll never match up. And I just think, I don't know, is that, does self-loathing equate? So there's so many things that we've done to call them worship. And of course, I you tell me to raise my hand, and I'm not going to raise my hand. I'm terrified to do that. Okay. And so there's so many things that are part of what we call the worship service that are not, I don't know. And for trauma survivors, it doesn't spark joy. And I
Hmm.
don't think for a lot of people, it always sparks joy to be in a, okay. So some of the latest research is that a church service has the same, especially when we do all the music and the hype and the bringing the crowd with us and everything, that
Hmm.
that they've done studies, and you walk out with the same dopamine fix that you would if you attended a concert.
Hmm.
And so does it feel good? Yeah, right. You're excited. Is it worship? For some, not for everyone. For some, it's overstimulating. Um, and so I think when we talk about worship, we have to talk about what is it. I asked on Facebook one day because I was thinking about this. I said, "What? When do you feel the closest to God?" I mean, isn't that really what worship is supposed to be?
Hmm.
Feeling close to God, and I probably had 100 people respond to me either privately or on the feed, and
Hmm.
only one person mentioned church. Everybody else was like, in my car,
Hmm.
when I go to the ocean, when I sit outside on my back porch, when I drink my coffee in the morning, right? It was. In fact, in my next book, I'm including this whole list of all these unbelievable ways that people experience and felt close to God, and that's really what worship is. So, so when we have someone who who doesn't believe God loves them, then that's going to be a difficult experience, isn't it? To
Hmm.
feel close to God. And we teach that God, which it doesn't say that. It does not say God turned his back on Jesus. Sorry. I just have to say that right here. Um when we believe that God turns his back on us, then that feels just like abandonment trauma.
Hmm.
And I think that we have to figure out how to help people um heal the trauma, heal all the ways that it's impacting them, and to find their own path to draw closer to God. There is nobody with a stronger faith than someone who has experienced trauma, has done their healing work, and come out on the other side with faith.
Hmm.
There's just, in my book, they are my rock stars, because there's just no one who can still have a relationship with God and have wonder and believe that God's in the game for them after the horrendous experiences of their life.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I'm wandering off a lot tonight, but I think that service, one of the key factors in healing trauma, is that you come out on the other side with a mission, and you use what you've learned and what you've done to go out and help others. Okay. And so what I do with these podcasts, with writing books, that's my service.
Hmm.
Okay, that is my service. And it's also a part of my healing. I think that sometimes we ask people to do service without the healing, and what happens is that after a while the service becomes an imposition, because they haven't fully healed, and they're not doing it out of a depth of wellness within
Hmm.
them, and a relationship with God that brings them mission. And I have to constantly go back and refocus and heal some more stuff,
Hmm.
and to watch that, because it's very easy to start serving out of obligation, out of pleasing others, out of, and not have it flow from my healing. And
Hmm.
so, yeah, I those are complicated, yes, complicated questions, I just want to say, because
Sure.
I wrote a whole book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you did mention something earlier I really wanted to ask you about, and this has been something that's just been bugging me. I'm really curious about. So let's talk about the idea of self-love. So I could be wrong. This is not something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, but as a child, you're kind of taught in church like, hey, you don't want to love yourself. You love others. Others almost come first. Uh,
Joy. Jesus,
jo-
others, you.
oh.
Why did you get taught
Oh
that?
wow.
Yeah.
I did. Yeah, that's a great example. Yeah, there
Yeah.
you go. So, but at the same time, like, I know for a fact that we have to love ourselves in at least some way if we are to, really do we want what we want to do as Christians, essentially. Like, there's so many hindrances when we, have so much self-doubt and anxiety and all that kind of stuff. So, what are your thoughts on just the idea of, you know,
Jesus,
should
others,
we
you.
love ourselves? Should
Yeah.
we love ourselves? Yeah.
Okay, so
What do you
what
think?
we have to think about, what is exactly does that mean? Like,
Okay.
what does it mean to love ourselves? I did a blog on it. And I mean, God created us. God created us with skills and interests and abilities, personality. I have two children, and I if I didn't dislike being pregnant so much, I probably would have had more, but it was not a happy experience for me. But
Hmm.
um, but every time I held them, I was like, oh my gosh, what are you gonna be? What what is your little personality going to be like? I mean, they come out of the womb with some of that personality. I had
Hmm.
one that was just cuddle cuddle, and I had one that was screaming, right? And so and that's how God looks at us. and yet we have taught this theology that God despises us, that God, and so and then we say, if you love yourself, if you love the creation that God created, like we say, you need to love all of that God created in the world, everything that God created, you need to love except yourself. I mean, that's a different category. You need to despise yourself because God's despise.
Hmm.
It doesn't even make sense, does it? And I think I have so many people, and I read so many places, that what when they realized that God does not despise his created being was when they held their first child, and they just looked at this amazing little being and they were like, oh my goodness, they're just so beautiful and perfect and amazing. And so um and so when we talk about loving ourselves, we're not talking about um loving ourselves in an egotistical way, right? Like, if loving yourself makes you feel better than the next person, then that's not what Jesus was talking about.
Hmm.
Okay. If loving yourself makes you connect better with the human race and be more compassionate with other people, because you understand the struggles in yourself and you understand the struggles in other people, and then that's what love your neighbor as yourself. If you can have, so I like to, instead of saying self love, I like to say self compassion,
Hmm.
that you have an understanding that, yes, you're human, yes, you have foibles, yes, you have impact of trauma, and yes, God loves you, and it unconditionally, absolutely unconditionally, and is in the game to help you be the very best created being you can be, and to love others as you do. As you have compassion on yourself, you can have compassion on other people. And
Hmm.
I think, Jesus as God, what he had so much compassion here on earth. He didn't come to earth and say, wow, this creation we made, this sucks, this is horrible. No, he just went around and loved people and met them where they were and had compassion for them. So I guess, when it says Jesus, others, and yourself, I don't think you can fully love other people unless you can develop that acceptance of yourself. I mean, think about yourself when you were like in middle school and in high school, and you hated other people, or you had, there was drama, especially, I'm a girl, so whatever, there's lots of drama, right? Right, where did that really come from? It didn't come because they were horrible people. It came from inside yourself a lot of times. I mean, yes, there were horrible people. Trust me, I understand there's horrible people. But why were they horrible people, right? I mean, we have to look at things differently in order. And so Jesus, okay, fine, Jesus. And then understand yourself, and grow to have compassion and love for yourself, and compassion for what you've lived through, and then out of that will grow a love for others that is unbounded. And
Hmm.
that's really where I am, right? Is that I'm not, I just, people say, why do you do it? Because I meet people and I just love people, right? And that has come from my healing. I always loved people, but I wasn't able to embrace them and connect with them in the ways that I can now, because I accept myself. So, yeah.
Yeah. That's great. No, I really like that approach. I've got lots to think about. I mean, it all makes sense. I just haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that, so that's really cool. So let's see here. What do you think is the best way for my listeners to react when they find someone that might be struggling with the same struggles that you might be talking about here? How should we react to that?
So I was looking at that question and I was like, what do I want to say? And my favorite term is to hold space for people, right? They don't
Okay.
need to be fixed. I think in several of my books that the messiest person you meet that's a trauma survivor is probably the strongest person you'd ever want to know. And so, sometimes just getting up every day and living their life is just a tremendous accomplishment. And so, I would say to see them as God's creation, to not try to fix them, to not, whatever you do not tell them right off the bat that what they need to do is to repent, because they what do they repent of? What was done to them? And that's what happens a lot of times, is because they feel so unworthy. They do feel like they need to repent, but in reality, they're repenting for what was done to them instead of what did they do. Once you've done a lot of healing, then you just are like, yeah, there's some things I need to, I need to go and tell people I'm sorry. There's a meme going around. I'm sorry for the thing I did when I was unhealed. That was, yeah.
Mm,
And so I think just to hold space for people, which is
yeah.
which is to say, if they tell you their story, be honored. I mean, I call them sacred stories. When somebody tells me what happened to them, I'm like, thank you for telling me this sacred story. That was so brave of you to tell me that. And I'm sorry that that happened to you. I'm so sorry that you were hurt in this way. And I want you to know it was not your fault, and that there, it's possible to heal from this, and to get, I don't, and when we say healed, there is no magic wand. It's possible to get the help that you need, and the support you need, and I'm going to be here for you and stay beside you while we work. And so just to hold space for people, that's really all anybody ever wants, is to feel seen. you know I
Hmm.
I I don't know how many times I get an email after I do a podcast or something, and they write me and they say, "Thank you. I felt seen today."
Hmm.
And I'm like, "And why didn't you feel seen? You've been in the church for like 50 years, and
Yeah.
all of a sudden this woman on a podcast is helping you to feel seen." And I just think we've missed it. We've missed the opportunity to do what people need most, which is to be seen.
Hmm.
So, I remember, the movie, the Avatar, and the one scene in it where the person says, "I see you." And I was watching it while I was healing, and I like cried for 2 hours at that part of the movie, because I was like, that's what I want. I just want someone to
Mm.
see me, to truly see me. And
Yeah.
that's what we can do for people. That's what the church should be. That's what the
Mm.
church should be.
Yeah. Yeah, and it doesn't even take that much effort sometimes either.
No. No. No, it doesn't.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, we have to set aside our judgment,
Yeah.
We have to set aside our ideas of, why they're in the mess that they're in, if they're in a mess, why they're struggling, we can't fix it. We're not trying to fix it. We're just saying, "I see you. I'm
Yeah.
sorry that this has happened to you. I'm sorry."
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's something. Okay, so we're wrapping up here, almost out of time. So, question for you: what would you recommend people do that they feel like they were in the place that you're talking about here, where they might have had some type of an unhealthy relationship with a parent or young childhood experience or something like that? What would you recommend they do?
So, there's several things, and sometimes you have to start by learning about trauma, okay? Just to understand, and I have all sorts of my website is Janyne.org, and I have lots of resources. There's a how do you become trauma informed page where it takes you down that. But sometimes you just need to understand more about trauma so you can understand yourself better, and then seek out professional help. And I have a page at my website that says, "So you're looking for a therapist," and it gives guidelines and suggestions,
Cool.
and it talks about the fact that a lot of times people want a Christian therapist, but sometimes it's hard to find a Christian therapist that is trauma informed. It's getting
Hmm.
better. Yay, 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 yay.
Yeah.
It's getting better. Um, and and then religious trauma, I don't have a lot on there yet about that, but that's a kind of a whole new a different area that requires
Yeah.
specialized help. So I think it's important to seek professional help, to build a village around yourself of people who will support you as you go through the healing journey,
Hmm.
and to learn what you can about trauma. And I want to say, like, okay, so trauma lives, the emotions, they are not in your prefrontal cortex. This is all your thinking brain up here, right? And so when you're learning about trauma, you're sitting in your thinking brain, but you only heal in your body and then the mid part of your brain. And so a lot of people, they gain all sorts of knowledge about trauma,
Yeah.
but they never get to the emotions, and that's where the healing takes place. And that's
Hmm.
what you really need, the guidance of a professional. If you've experienced childhood trauma, you
Hmm.
really need that help as you go through that, because it is not an easy path, and it takes courage and bravery and support to do that.
Yeah.
So those would be my suggestions.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Totally agree. So, yeah, it's been a pleasure having you on here today. Is there any last thoughts you have before I let you go?
I whenever I get off, I'm always like, why did I talk about that? And then it's really funny because somebody will email me and say, when you talked about that thing, and I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, that's why I talked about that. So, but I'm always open. You can go to my website and do the contact and email me, and I always email people back. So if you don't hear back from me, then something wrong happened, because I never want anyone to feel like they reached out to someone and didn't get heard or seen.
Hmm.
And so, I think that I am just living my life. I didn't start healing till I was 60, and I just want to live the rest of my life telling people that it is worth the process of healing, and there is hope, and it will bring you closer to God, which is the purpose of spiritual practices.
Hmm. Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, thank you so much for coming on here. This has
Thank you
been
for
such a
having me.
blessing. Yes, that's
I'm
been
so glad to
my
meet you and
pleasure.
have this
Oh,
conversation.
yes, of course. Yes, me as well. I can't wait to tell everybody about this, and I know a lot of people will be affected by this. So this is great. So I just I can't thank you enough for coming on here. It's such a pleasure, and thank you so much. Definitely, everybody go check out her books. You'll learn a lot. It'll change your life.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, just thank you so much for coming on. I hope you have a great rest of your night.
You too.